The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and pine, and for the first time in many months, I allowed myself to believe that the forest could hold a peace unbroken, a quiet that belonged entirely to me, though even in that stillness there was a whisper of unease I could not name. I wandered along the familiar paths, tracing the curves of roots and rocks, feeling the gentle pull of life around me, the way the sunlight sifted through the high branches and dappled the forest floor like scattered silver coins, and I thought of nothing beyond the rhythm of my own steps and the soft murmur of the stream winding through the moss, though sometimes I paused to listen and noticed a strange absence, a silence that seemed to press in from the edges of the trees, heavier than ordinary quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, somewhere beyond the curve of the hill, a low, distant howl floated across the valleys, so faint I could have convinced myself it was only a trick of the wind, except that it carried an uncanny resonance, a depth that felt almost like memory rather than sound, and I shivered despite the warmth of the sun on my face, telling myself I was imagining things, though my heart skipped, attuned to something beyond my understanding. I sat by the stream, letting my fingers skim the water, watching the patterns ripple and bend, and in the glint of the sunlight on the moving current, I thought I caught the briefest flicker of movement at the tree-line, a shadow so fluid it could have been wind, or something watching, calculating, patient, and my pulse quickened as I tried to focus, but there was nothing, only the long, quiet pause between bird calls and the rustle of leaves, yet a small, burning light lingered at the edge of my vision, a faint crimson glow, too deliberate to be natural, and I reflecting a presence I could not see fully, and though I could not hear it breathing or moving, I felt it like a weight pressing lightly on my awareness, as if the forest itself was reminding me that I was no longer alone, though I was the only one aware of it, and I told myself stories to rationalize it, perhaps a fox, a wandering hawk, or the trick of sunlight through the canopy, but even as I clutched at normal explanations, the feeling remained, a thrum in my bones, a silent invitation and warning intertwined, and I rose to my feet, brushing damp moss from my skirt, and the forest seemed to shift subtly under my gaze, the air heavier, charged in a way that made my skin prickle, carrying the scent of something wild, something ancient that did not belong entirely to this quiet morning, and in that suspended moment, I sensed a thread stretching outward from me into the unseen, a signal that my small, ordinary life, so carefully woven into patterns of chores and walks and whispered thoughts to myself, was on the verge of unraveling, that the stillness I treasured was fragile, that destiny, silent and patient like the shadow at the tree-line, had already begun to move toward me, and as I turned back to the stream, trying to gather courage and calm, I caught the crimson flicker again, lingering longer this time, and the forest exhaled softly around me, almost in anticipation, and I knew, though I could not name it yet, that the quiet before destiny was ending, and someone, was waiting just beyond the trees to change the rhythm of my life forever. The evening draped the forest in shadows that clung to every tree and rock, and I wandered through the familiar paths with a growing sense of unease, feeling as though the very air had grown heavier, thicker with unspoken words and quiet expectation, as though the world itself had shifted imperceptibly while I slept, for even my own heartbeat sounded foreign, a drum echoing in a space that no longer felt entirely mine, and in that heaviness, I noticed the pack moving differently, the elders exchanging glances I could not understand, the young ones restless in ways that made the edges of my nerves hum, subtle shifts of loyalty and unease twisting through the clearing like a current just beneath the surface, and in my dreams, which arrived like mist curling over the hills as soon as my eyes closed, I saw visions both familiar and impossible, the forest burning in slow motion, wolves with eyes like molten gold and silver streaks of light tracing their forms, a moon carved from shadow and flame hovering low, and through it all, one figure that appeared again and again, silent, watching, a dark wolf with a glowing red left eye that pierced the dream with unspoken questions and warnings, its presence neither threatening nor comforting, only certain, and when I awoke, the visions lingered like the taste of ash on my tongue, a sense of inevitability that I could neither shake nor deny. Throughout the day, coincidences multiplied, tiny gestures and events that seemed orchestrated, a broken branch exactly where I planned to step, a sudden gust of wind carrying the scent of something unfamiliar, the way the sun struck the forest floor to illuminate a single path even when I had meant to go another way, and always, in the periphery of my sight, there was movement, a shadow slipping between the trees, the faintest glint of crimson light, a sign I could not yet interpret, and I began to notice it was not just me who felt the change, for the Alpha King moved with quieter intensity, the pack watching him with an alertness tinged with unease, and I realized the balance I had taken for granted in their world was shifting, responding to something beyond my understanding. And then Kale appeared more clearly than ever before, stepping into a clearing just long enough for me to see the curve of his muscles, the darkness of his fur absorbing the light, the red eye fixed on me with a focus that made my stomach tighten, and though he did not speak, he left symbols in his wake. A feather black at its base and silver at its tip placed on a stone I had intended to step over, the faint scratch of claws along a tree that seemed to form a message I could not yet read, a single howl that seemed directed at me alone, warning, urging, and guiding, yet never revealing, and each time I looked for him again, he was gone, vanished into shadow as if he had never been there, leaving only a pulse of awareness that made the hairs along my arms rise. The sun dipped low, turning the sky a bruised purple, and the forest seemed to lean closer, the wind whispering through the leaves like voices too soft to interpret, and it was in that dimming light that a realization struck me with the force of a sudden storm. I was no longer walking through life of my own choosing, that every dream, every coincidence, every shadow I thought I had ignored was part of a current far stronger than myself, and as I paused to listen, the red glow flickered once more between the trees, like a beacon in the darkness, and I understood with a chill running down my spine that I was being guided, pushed, and watched by a force I could neither name nor resist, a presence both protective and inexorably mysterious, and the forest seemed to hold its breath around me as though waiting for me to take the next step into a destiny I had not yet dared to imagine. The forest seemed to pulse around me that evening, every shadow stretching longer than reason allowed, the air thick with anticipation and a subtle hum that I could feel in my bones, as though the world itself had begun to whisper secrets it had long kept hidden. And then he appeared. The Alpha, a presence so magnetic and commanding that it bent the gaze of every creature and every leaf toward him without a single word, his silver-gray coat glinting faintly under the last rays of the dying sun, eyes deep pools that seemed to hold storms and calm all at once, and when they settled on me, I felt the pull of something ancient and binding, a tether I could neither see nor resist, as though my own heartbeat had started to echo his, synchronized across space and time in a way that made the forest itself lean closer in silence. The pack, usually a sea of murmurs and shifting glances, froze in reverence and subtle fear, and even the wind softened as though it did not dare disturb the moment, carrying with it the faintest sense of herbs, iron, and something older than memory, older than the hills themselves, and I realized with a trembling clarity that this figure was more than a leader, more than a being of flesh and fur, that he carried a weight of destiny intertwined with mine, a force that could elevate or destroy in equal measure. And as I tried to ground myself against the pull of awe and fear, Kale emerged from the shadows, his form darker than the night itself, the red glow of his left eye cutting through the twilight like a warning etched in fire, and his voice, low and deliberate, reached me though he made no step toward the clearing. Your world stands on a lie. The words fell like stones into a quiet pond, and I felt them ripple through every certainty I had held about my life, my pack, my place in the forest. And for the first time, I understood that the threads I had trusted were frayed, that the quiet patterns of my days had masked fractures I could no longer ignore. The Alpha moved closer, silent yet potent, a figure that demanded recognition not through threat but through inevitability, and as our eyes met, the air between us seemed to twist and stretch, a tangible tension that carried the weight of unspoken truths, prophecies, and choices I had not yet made, while behind him, the forest stirred in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, every rustle and distant howl shaping the rhythm of the moment as if the land itself were preparing to disclose secrets. Images flashed in my mind unbidden, visions of past leaders I had only heard of in stories, battles fought in moonlight, alliances formed and shattered, the hidden corridors of power within the pack that none dared speak of aloud, and I realized that all my beliefs about loyalty, love, safety, and the natural order were suddenly fragile, like frost under the sun, melting with alarming speed. And Kale's red eye lingered on me, silent, his presence a tether to a reality I could not yet comprehend, and the Alpha's gaze held a quiet intensity that made it impossible to look away, impossible to pretend I was merely a spectator in the unfolding of this forest's hidden laws, and the world felt both smaller and infinitely larger, every choice weighted with consequence, every whisper a warning, and I understood in the marrow of my bones that the life I had clung to, the innocence I had nurtured in the quiet hours by the stream and in the paths I knew by heart, was already slipping from my grasp, that the illusions I had carried, of control, of safety, of understanding, were beginning to shatter like glass beneath the paw of some unseen force, and as the Alpha stepped closer still, the wind shifting around him like an invisible tide, Cale slipping once more into shadow with only the faintest glint of red in his eye, and the pack watching with a mix of awe and fear, I felt the first real fracture in the core of my beliefs, the recognition that nothing in my world would ever be the same, that destiny, patient and relentless, had arrived, and the lie upon which everything I had known had rested was unraveling, leaving me raw, unsteady, and yet, impossibly drawn toward the path I could no longer avoid. The night was thick with shadows that clung to every branch, every stone, and even the wind seemed to whisper secrets meant only for ears attuned to the unseen, and as I lay beneath the canopy of stars, sleep found me reluctantly, bringing with it dreams that were less dreams and more echoes of memories I could not claim as my own, visions of the pack's past unfurling in fractured glimpses, the rise of leaders long forgotten, battles fought beneath moons that burned silver and black at once, the weaving of alliances sealed with blood and oath, betrayals whispered in the dark that had shaped every tree and trail I had ever known, and the faces of ancestors I had never met stared at me through these shifting illusions, their eyes heavy with warning and expectation, while emotions I did not recognize, grief, fury, longing, rose from somewhere deep in my marrow and tangled with my own, blurring the boundary between what I had lived and what had merely been recorded in the pulse of the forest, and through it all, Cale appeared, always at the edge, his shadow darker than the night itself, his glowing red eye cutting through the haze of my visions like a blade of awareness, silent yet insistent, leaving signs and symbols that I could only half understand, a claw-marked tree that formed a strange rune, a feather black and silver set atop my pillow in the dream as if laid by some unseen hand, a single echoing howl that shook the air but left no trace of its source, and each time he appeared, he moved me closer to truth while leaving the answers just beyond reach, a guide and a challenge intertwined in one impossibly elusive being. The dreams grew vivid, slipping into my waking hours, memories bleeding into visions so that when I walked through the forest, the rustle of leaves felt like whispers of ancient councils, the sunlight through the branches painted symbols only I could see, and every step echoed with the weight of centuries of secrets, until I began to understand that the pack itself was built upon truths half-hidden, decisions made in desperation that had rippled through generations, and buried beneath it all was a prophecy never spoken aloud, known only to a select few and written in the rhythm of the forest. A luna would rise in a time of fractured moons and shifting tides, bound by fate to the Alpha, tasked not merely with protection but with restoring balance, carrying both the memory of what had been lost and the power to shape what was to come, a role intertwined with the pack's survival and the forest's hidden magic. I felt my chest tighten as memories and dreams collided, grief for what had been hidden, awe for the weight of destiny, and a creeping fear for the path laid out before me, and in that suffocating clarity, Cale appeared once more, stepping from shadow into faint moonlight, his eye reflecting knowledge I could not yet claim, and for the first time I saw him not as a distant observer but as a subtle architect, a force shaping choices without words, nudging me along the lines of fate while letting me believe I still moved freely. I traced the patterns of his appearances in my mind, realizing he had always been present at moments when my understanding of the world began to fracture, guiding without interference, warning without speaking, and each flash of crimson in the dark now felt like a tether to a truth I could not ignore, as though the forest itself had appointed him my unseen guardian and messenger. And then it struck me, a realization that cut through the fog of dreams and waking alike, making my knees weak and my heartbeat stutter in awe. The life I had known, the quiet, ordinary days I had cherished, the sense of control I had clung to like a talisman, had been an illusion, a fragile mask over the deeper currents of history, power, and magic that had always flowed through the pack, and I understood in that instant that my purpose was no longer defined by survival or comfort, but by the prophecy itself, by the duty etched into the bloodlines, by the unseen forces of the forest and the pack that now called me to act, to lead, and to face a destiny I had never imagined, a life-altering truth that reshaped not only my understanding of the world around me but also the very essence of who I was meant to become. And as the first pale light of dawn brushed the edges of the forest, I rose with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same, that the path before me was both terrifying and undeniable, and that I had been chosen to carry the weight of history, magic, and survival in a role that would test everything I believed, guided silently by the shadow of Kale and the whispers of a destiny older than memory itself. The forest had grown restless, the air thick with tension and unspoken questions that weighed on my chest as if the trees themselves held their breath, and I moved through the shadows with a cautious step, feeling the pulse of the pack around me, the subtle shifts in their loyalties, the unspoken glances that carried both hope and doubt, knowing in a way that unsettled me that trust was fragile here, as fragile as the thin layer of frost that clung to the moss underfoot, and I could feel it in every interaction, the hesitance of those who once followed me with ease, the glimmer of fear in eyes that had always been steady, and the gnawing ache of responsibility pressing on my ribs, reminding me that choices had consequences heavier than words could carry, that every decision I made would ripple through the lives of those I had come to care for and those I had yet to understand. The Alpha, magnetic and commanding as ever, walked among the pack, his presence a constant reminder of the destiny that hung over us all, and I could feel the pull of his gaze, a tether of expectation that made my every step feel measured, deliberate, and yet, despite his strength and authority, there were moments of hesitation, cracks in certainty, that mirrored the tremor in my own heart, and I realized that even he could not shoulder the weight of what was coming without me, that the balance of loyalty, survival, and prophecy rested heavily on my shoulders as well, pressing me toward decisions I did not wish to make but could not avoid, and through it all, Kale lingered closer than ever, a shadow that moved with the wind, always at the periphery of my vision, a crimson flicker against the black of the forest, his presence less a warning now than a pulse, a steady heartbeat of destiny brushing against my own, reminding me that I was not alone, that every choice, every moment of fear or doubt, was being observed, nudged, shaped by a force I could not yet name, and when I felt the weight of the pack's eyes and the Alpha's silent expectation, I knew Kale was watching, waiting for the exact instant I needed to step into my role without needing words, a silent guide woven into the rhythm of my unfolding life. Trust, once a certainty I carried lightly, began to fracture under the strain of necessity, the emotional bonds I had relied upon stretching taut as I made decisions that were right yet painful, that preserved lives while leaving hearts raw, that demanded courage I had not known I possessed, and with each choice, a part of the comfortable world I had clung to slipped further from my grasp, leaving me both terrified and resolute, aware that to protect what mattered, I must embrace sacrifice, and the forest around me seemed to echo this unspoken truth, leaves rustling like whispers, wind brushing like a hand over my shoulder, carrying the weight of unseen judgment and approval. As dusk fell, painting the sky in bruised purples and molten gold, a confrontation came that tested everything I had built, the Alpha's demands pressing me toward a decision that would fracture friendships, challenge loyalty, and reveal the true depths of my strength, and though I moved with care, my heart ached with the knowledge that pain was inevitable, that even the most tender bonds could not remain untouched by the storm I carried within me, and I felt Kale's eye upon me again, red and steady, the silent promise of presence and guidance, yet impossibly distant, as if he was both part of the forest and above it, tied to my fate in ways I did not fully understand, and in the moment when I had to choose, I felt the full weight of destiny pressing down, every step forward exacting a toll, and I made the choice, one that spared life yet demanded absence, that preserved the pack's fragile balance yet left a chasm in my own heart, a separation that resonated deep and silent, echoing like a distant howl through the forest, and I turned away, chest heavy with grief yet sharpened by resolve, knowing that sacrifice was the price of the path I had been drawn onto, that destiny had claimed its first mark upon me, and that Kale's presence, hidden yet undeniable, had guided me through the storm, leaving me both shattered and strengthened, aware more than ever that the trials ahead would demand everything, and that even in solitude, I was not truly alone, tethered to forces older and greater than I could comprehend, and as I walked away from what I had lost, the wind carried a faint, almost imperceptible echo of his crimson eye in the shadows, a reminder that destiny, patient and relentless, watched over me still. The first light of dawn brushed the tips of the forest trees with gold and amber, and I stood on the ridge, the cool wind carrying the scent of pine, earth, and something older than memory, while below me the pack moved with a quiet obedience, their eyes following the subtle rhythm of my decisions, their trust, hard-won through storms, sacrifice, and whispers of destiny, settled on me like a tangible weight, and I felt, finally, the full measure of what it meant to be the Luna, Not merely a shadow in the pack, not a passive witness to prophecy, but the pulse at its center, the heart through which past, present, and future flowed, and as I took a deep breath, I sensed the forest itself holding its breath with me, as though acknowledging the balance restored, yet also hinting at mysteries I had not yet uncovered. The Alpha King approached, regal and steady, his silver gray fur glinting faintly in the rising light, his gaze softening as it met mine, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between us that what had been fractured, what had been uncertain, had found its place, though the path ahead remained shrouded in twilight, in questions still unanswered, and I understood that the role I embraced was not a conclusion but a threshold, a calling that demanded vigilance, courage, and heart, and as the pack settled into the harmony of this new dawn, I felt the subtle stir of another presence, familiar yet distant, a pulse at the edges of the light and shadow, and from the trees that lined the ridge, Cale emerged one last time, his massive form blending with the forest as he stepped forward, silent but undeniable, his crimson eye glowing briefly as if burning away the remaining doubts, and he left behind a single mark, a carved rune in the bark of an ancient oak, a feather black at its base and silver at its tip, the same symbol he had left countless times before, now a farewell and a message intertwined, a puzzle I could not yet fully decipher, and I knew without hearing it spoken that his presence had always been a guide, a shadow shaping fate, a quiet sentinel over my steps, and now, he was stepping back into legend, retreating into the shadows where the living and the myth converged, leaving only the memory of a red eye lingering like embers at the edge of my vision. I raised my gaze to the horizon where sunlight spilled over hills and valleys, painting the forest with warmth and promise, and the distant howl of a wolf echoed through the trees, carrying sorrow and hope, warning and welcome, a sound that seemed to ripple across time itself, and somewhere in that resonance, I thought I caught the faintest glimmer of crimson fading into the morning, the echo of Cale's watchful presence dissolving into the world yet leaving me aware that he had shaped my journey irrevocably, that the threads of destiny he had tugged at were now mine to weave, mine to guard, and mine to honor, and as I stepped forward into the light, feeling the weight and the freedom of the Luna's mantle settle fully upon me, I understood that the forest, the pack, the prophecy, and even Cale's cryptic guidance were only the beginning, that my story had opened into a larger world of mysteries, challenges, and hidden truths, that every howl yet to come, every shadow, every faint pulse in the trees would speak to the life I had chosen and the destiny I could no longer escape, and with the sunrise gilding my path, the echo of that red eye fading into silence, I took a deep, steadying breath, heart beating in time with the forest, with the pack, with the unseen currents of fate, and I stepped into the first moment of my true role, fully aware that this ending was only the prelude to countless stories yet to be told, the legacy of the red-eyed wolf lingering in the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the distant howl that promised the adventure of destiny was far from over.